He built his fame mocking her. His own disabled wife and live TV, turning her pain into punchlines. Audiences laughed. Sponsors cheered. And she disappeared from the spotlight without a word. Until one day, she came back. Not to shout, not to confront, just to sit quietly in the third row and change everything. If you've ever been erased from your own story or watched someone rewrite your truth while the world applauded, this will stay with you. Because sometimes the loudest reckoning comes without raising a voice. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The applause sign lit up again, and the audience dutifully responded. A wave of sound rising on cue, just as the floor manager had trained them. Darren Locke gave his trademark wink toward camera too, leaned back with an easy confidence, and adjusted the cuff of his tailored blazer. He thrived in this kind of energy, shallow, structured, and entirely in his control. It was performance wrapped in routine. He reached for the mug on his desk, lifted it just enough to take a non-sip, and then set it down again. "Let's talk about commitment," he said, turning toward the crowd. "Or what passes for it these days." Laughter sprinkled lightly. He waited a beat. "You know you're in trouble when the biggest weight in your life isn't the mortgage. It's the person sitting across from you that got a louder laugh. Not raucous, but appreciative." Darren fed it with a knowing smirk. His writers had worked out the rhythm ahead of time. Build a little tension, release it with a punchline, then lean into the shared cynicism. Audiences liked it when they felt in on the joke, especially the ones about marriage. Everyone had baggage. Everyone had a story. Darren just said the parts. Most people kept quiet. "I mean, if we're being honest," he continued, shifting slightly in his chair, "sometimes the vows should read, in sickness and in health, ... until the paperwork clears." The laughter was sharper now, peppered with a few gasps that quickly dissolved into more chuckling. Some clapped, a few heads shook in mock disbelief, as if to say, "He went there." Darren smiled wider. He felt control, the rhythm, the room moving with him. He continued, "I once knew a guy married a woman who had a health condition. At first, he was all in, supportive, there for every doctor's appointment. But after a while, all the patients in the world doesn't fix the fact that your life becomes a waiting room. A really expensive, really exhausting waiting room." The audience was quieter now, still smiling, still nodding, but the energy had shifted. A few looked around to gauge how others were reacting. Still, some laughed. A few too. Loudly in the third row, seat 3F, a woman sat unmoving. Her hands rested on her lap, her face unreadable. She had not clapped. She had not laughed. Her expression hadn't changed. She watched Darren the way someone might observe a play they'd already seen one, where the ending was no longer a surprise. Her presence was unassuming, but her stillness gave her weight. A man beside her glanced over, as if sensing something off. He looked back to the stage, then back to her, then turned his attention forward again, with unease he couldn't quite explain. On stage, Darren kept going. At some point, you have to ask, are you a partner, or are you a caretaker who pays the bills and pretends there's still a relationship? He chuckled. And don't get me wrong, bless anyone who sticks it out. But let's not pretend. We don't all have a limit. The camera cut briefly to the audience, smiles, polite laughter. A woman in the second row leaned toward her friend and whispered something with raised eyebrows. But the camera didn't linger. It didn't show the third row. It didn't catch the blue scarf or the stillness of the woman beneath it. Darren stood from his chair, signaling the transition to the next segment. Coming up after the break relationship, expert Dr. Kendra Vale joins us to explain why sometimes the best thing you can do for love ... is walk away. He gave the camera a playful finger gun and a lopsided grin, then sat back down as the theme music played. From her seat in 3F, the woman with the scarf did not move. Her eyes remained locked on Darren, her jaw set. She looked not angry, not sad, but familiar, as if she had heard every line before, as if she knew the real ending and was just waiting for the show to catch up. The studio lights flared to life in a wave of polished brightness, illuminating every polished surface and every perfectly rehearsed expression. Red lights blinked over camera 3, then camera 1, signaling the countdown. The audience warmed. up by a peppy comedian who had already left the stage, burst into applause on cue. From behind the gleaming silver and white backdrop, Darren Locke stepped forward, teeth bright. Suit sharper than the prompter text, scrolling just beyond the lens. "Good morning, everyone." His voice boomed with practiced ease, each syllable landing exactly where it needed to. Welcome back to Morning Talk with Darren Locke, your favorite daily escape from everything dull and serious. The crowd laughed politely, some genuinely, others because they knew the drill. Clap, smile, nod, be the studio version of yourself. Behind the set, the producers kept their headsets adjusted tight. The teleprompter tech scrolled the script in smooth, timed motion. Floor managers gestured with flat palms. Darren was a reliable host, comfortable, charismatic enough to keep viewers tuned in, but not enough to outshine the product placements. His segments ran on time. He hit commercial cues. He played the lovable cynic. The audience knew what to expect from him. Until today. Today's segment was titled New Love, New Rules, a light piece on modern dating standards. Darren leaned on his stool, legs crossed at the ankle, and made a joke about how hard it was to find someone who doesn't come with emotional debt or a complicated medical file. The joke earned a louder laugh than usual, and he fed off it quickly. "Oh, and don't even get me started on the ones who want you to carry them figuratively or literally," he smirked. A few people gasped, but most laughed. The cadence, the delivery, it softened the edge. Darren had a way of making cruelty sound charming. Up in the third row, she didn't move. The woman in seat 3F sat quietly, hands folded over a small purse in her lap. Her scarf was bright blue, a gentle contrast to the rows of neutral-toned clothing. Surrounding her, she hadn't clapped, she hadn't laughed, but her presence, though unnoticed by most, was already changing the shape of the air around her. Darren shifted on his stool and launched into a story about a woman he once knew, who would complain about curb heights and inaccessible restaurants. "She made every dinner feel like a guilt trip with a ramp," he said, chuckling. And the audience joined him, unsure where the punchline ended and the truth began. "Let's just say I needed someone with a little more mobility physically." And emotionally, the laughter rippled out, but it was quieter this time. In the control booth, one of the assistant producers furrowed her brow. She glanced at the seating chart. There was no listing for the woman in 3F. Her name hadn't been on the audience clearance list. The producer typed a quiet message into the group chat. "Anyone confirms seat 3F, unregistered." Down on the floor, Darren hadn't noticed. He was mid-story, reenacting a conversation in a mock feminine voice, mimicking an exaggerated tone that made his point clear without needing to name names. He thought it was clever, the kind of thing that would go viral in clipped video snippets. He had no idea that it already had. From where she sat, the woman in blue watched him speak with the familiarity of someone who had once known every version of his laugh. She didn't flinch. She didn't interrupt. She simply watched, silent and upright, her body perfectly still, as if carved from a stronger kind of steel. Backstage, someone knocked twice on the studio manager's door and said quietly, "We may have a situation," but the show went on because the lights were still on, the cameras were still rolling, and Darren Locke was still smiling, still talking, still unaware that the next 30 minutes of his show would be replayed and redefined, not because of the jokes he told, but because of who was watching. The hallway outside the studio was quiet in the minutes before the show. The pre-show buzz had moved inside producers, checking final camera angles, the audio team syncing up wireless mics, the floor manager calling out seating instructions. But just beyond the side entrance near the guest check-in table, a woman waited. She sat with calm stillness, her bag resting neatly on her lap, her hands folded over it. She wasn't on the clipboard. Her name wasn't printed on the audience manifest, nor was it entered digitally in the assistant's iPad. When the production assistant approached, apologetic and prepared to redirect her outside, the woman reached into her bag and handed over a folded form, signed, initialed, complete. The assistant furrowed her brow. "I'm sorry, this wasn't submitted in advance. Did someone call it in?" The woman shook her head once. "Is someone expecting you?" Another shake, "Ma'am, I can check with security. I don't need a mic," the woman said gently, interrupting. "Just a seat," the assistant blinked. She was young, maybe 22, early in her career, and trained to follow rules while still keeping things smooth. She studied the signature on the waiver. The last name was familiar. Too familiar. Her eyes lifted. She looked closer at the woman's face, and something clicked. But before she could ask anything, the woman added, "I won't speak. I'm not here to make a scene." The assistant hesitated. Then she slowly nodded and typed something quietly into her tablet. Manual ad Seat 3F. Cleared by waiver, no one noticed her enter. The audience was already half-seated, distracted by the warm-up comedian who was testing mic levels with half-hearted jokes. The woman wheeled herself to her row, her movement practiced and smooth, and settled into her designated space without comment. She removed her scarf and folded it into her lap. Backstage, one of the producers looked up from his headset. "Who's 3F?" he asked without looking away from the control monitor. "Late ad signed her own waiver," came the reply. "Cleared." "Yeah, quiet," said she just wanted to watch. The producer made a sound of reluctant approval. "Fine, no mic. Keep her off camera unless she reacts. We're tight on timing." The rest of the crew moved on. There were segments to rehearse. Darren was going over cue cards, changing a few lines with a marker, as he often did last minute. The wardrobe assistant gave him a quick lint roll. The graphics guy double-checked lower thirds. No one asked again about the woman. Not really, not until later, but in that moment. The silence was thick. The assistant who let her in hovered behind the curtain now, hands folded, unsure what she'd just allowed. She didn't know the full story, but she could feel the shape of it. The woman in 3F hadn't arrived the way most people did. She hadn't brought excitement or nerves. She hadn't asked for backstage passes or selfies. There had been no fan energy, no rehearsed admiration, just the request. "I need no mic, just a seat." And she wasn't watching like someone entertained. She was watching like someone remembering. Backstage, Darren adjusted his lapel mic and nodded at the stage manager. "Let's do this." The applause sign lit up. The countdown began. The cameras started to roll, and out in the third row, the woman who didn't belong to any segment, who had nothing prepared, and who had said she wouldn't speak was already changing the room just by sitting in it. 3 years earlier, Darren and Elise were inseparable not just in life, but in every corner of the internet. Their YouTube channel, Darren and Elise Do Everything, had climbed to nearly 1 million subscribers in under a year. What started as a casual series of travel vlogs soon evolved into something that felt like a living scrapbook. Road trips across the Pacific Northwest, DIY home renovation challenges, side-by-side reaction videos. Even the mundane grocery hauls, morning routines was wrapped in their laughter and cut together. With upbeat music and soft color grading, they were the kind of couple people rooted for. Not flashy, not overly polished, just genuine enough to be aspirational. Elise had a dry wit and a smile that punctuated every scene with warmth. Darren was the talker, the planner, the one who reached for the camera first. Their chemistry didn't need scripting. Comments flooded in. "You to give me hope. This is what love looks like. Marry her already." So when Darren posted a video titled "She Said Yes," footage of a lakeside proposal with a drone shot and all rejoiced. The ring, the sunset. Her tearful yes, it went viral within days. The wedding was live-streamed 6 months later, a modest ceremony in Oregon's wine country. Elise wore a simple satin dress with sleeves that fluttered in the breeze. Darren cried before she even made it down the aisle. They edited the video with slow-motion sequences, music that crescendoed right as they kissed. It felt like a storybook. They bought a fixer-upper after the honeymoon. Elise painted cabinets in worn jeans, hair and a scarf. Darren demoed old tiles with safety goggles and dad jokes. Followers watched their progress like it was a shared project. There was a baby announcement, caught on camera, of course. Elise held up a positive test while Darren blinked in disbelief, then scooped her up, spinning her around until she laughed and scolded him for being too rough. The video got 2 million views in 3 days. Then everything stopped. There was no dramatic video, no teary explanation, just silence. 1 week turned into 2, then a month. Comments piled up. "Are you guys okay? Where's Elise? Still pregnant?" The channel's last post was a short, shaky video taken from inside a hospital. Roomit never showed her face, just Darren's. His voice was quieter, flat, He said, "Life changed. We'll explain later." Later never came. The accident had happened on a Thursday night. Elise had driven herself to the store. Darren had stayed behind, editing a video about painting the nursery. Black ice on a curve, a van that hadn't slowed. The impact crushed the passenger side. Elise was found conscious but trapped. She spent 12 hours in surgery. When she woke up, her spine had been fused in 3 places. The doctors said she'd never walk again. Darren was there for the first week. He brought flowers, slept upright in the chair beside her, smiled for the nurses, and kept his voice light. Elise clutched his hand when they explained her prognosis. He squeezed back and said, "We'll figure it out." But something had shifted. The camera was never brought in. Darren stopped updating their followers. When Elise asked if he wanted to share an update, he deflected, "Maybe later." The visitors slowed. The videos stopped. The subscribers kept waiting. When Elise finally came home 2 months later, nothing looked the same. Their shared channel hadn't posted in 10 weeks. Her name disappeared from the banner. The profile picture changed to just Darren. The intro, music, was gone. And when a new video finally went up, him alone, hosting a new series about solo home improvement, Elise sat in the background, off camera. Her presence acknowledged only by a faint sound of her wheelchair as she moved across the hardwood floor. No one ever said what happened, but piece by piece, her part in the story was erased. It was supposed to be a quick errand, just a late-night craving for something sweet and a carton of milk for the next morning's pancakes. Elise had offered to go. Alondrin was editing video footage from that afternoon, still in joggers, headphones on, clicking between jump cuts of them painting the nursery walls. It had been a productive day. They'd argued about whether to use seafoam or pale lavender, and Elise had one. She usually did. Outside, the winter storm had calmed. The snow had stopped hours earlier, and the roads looked clear beneath the glow of the streetlights. Elise grabbed her scarf, keys, and purse and said she'd be back in 20 minutes. Darren nodded from behind the screen and mumbled something about maple syrup. She drove slowly. The town was quiet, its sidewalks buried under soft drifts. Most stores were closed. The supermarket near the gas station was open for another hour. She played a podcast on the car stereo, humming softly. Her hands rested gently at 10 and 2. She hadn't even made it out of their neighborhood before the tires lost grip. The black ice wasn't visible. That's how it always worked. A smooth patch at the base of the hill near Sycamore Drive. The incline was subtle enough that most drivers wouldn't think twice. Elise hadn't either. Not until the car began to drift sideways. She tapped the brakes to quickly end the wheels. Locked dot, she remembered the van's headlights first. Then the crunch of metal. Then silence. The passenger side took the full impact. The van had been speeding downhill, unable to stop in time. Elise's car spun and stopped against a lamppost, crumpled inward like a paper model. The airbags deployed. The engine hissed. The cold crept in fast. She was awake the entire time. When the paramedics arrived, she could speak, she could blink. But she couldn't feel anything below her ribcage. Darren didn't answer his phone on the first call, or the second. The hospital left a voicemail. By the time he arrived, Elise was already in surgery. The hospital corridors smelled of antiseptic and tired coffee. Nurses moved quickly, quietly. Darren stood alone, arms crossed tightly, rocking back and forth like a child trying not to panic. When a doctor finally spoke to him, it was with the professional calm of someone trained to deliver impossible information. 3 vertebrae shattered, spinal cord damage. Thoracic region, the words blurred in Darren's mind, but one phrase stuck: permanent paralysis. When Elise woke up, he was there. She blinked slowly, her voice barely audible. He told her she'd been in an accident. She nodded. She already knew. She asked about the baby. The impact had come too soon, too violently. She'd lost more than her legs that night. The days that followed blurred together. Machines beeped steadily. Elise's pain was managed, but her expression had changed. Quieter, less of the teasing edge. She tried to joke something about having more time to read now, but Darren didn't laugh. The nurses praised her for her strength. The doctors said she was lucky, she was alive. But the future they'd spent a year building had been flattened. In an instant, the house they shared was suddenly filled with barriers. The stairs, The narrow bathroom, the thresholds they hadn't noticed before. Darren called contractors, made plans to adjust things, but the sparkle had dulled in his voice. Elise noticed. She watched him fumble with routines, watched him pause before helping her dress, watched the way his hand hesitated before touching the chair. He wasn't cruel, not yet, just overwhelmed. She asked once, "Are you still in this?" He kissed her forehead and said yes, but his eyes darted away. She never asked again. The footage from those early days in the hospital still lived online, buried under layers of older uploads and quiet re-uploads by fan accounts. Darren had shared a short clip titled, "Our New Beginning." It was less than 3 minutes long. Set to soft piano music, it showed him seated beside Elise's hospital bed, gently holding her hand while she rested. He spoke softly to the camera, thanking followers for their support, saying they were taking things one day at a time. Her face was pale, her body motionless beneath the white blanket, but she smiled weakly when he looked at her. Viewers flooded the comments with encouragement. "This is real love," someone wrote. "You're so lucky to have each other." What the camera didn't capture were the long hours in between the weight of new routines, the silence that grew louder with each passing week. Elise's recovery was slow and filled with thresholds no one could prepare her for. Not just physical, one's wheelchair training, bladder control, phantom nerve pain, but emotional thresholds. The grief came in strange shapes. She wept not because she couldn't walk, but because she couldn't feel the floor. She grieved for the way Darren used to rest his hand on her lower back, for the way he'd pull her into a hug without thinking. Now his touch felt careful, measured, like handling something fragile or worse, foreign. She tried to bring him in, invited him to join her during physical therapy sessions, to watch her learn to balance, to maneuver curbs, to fall and try again. At first, he smiled at the therapists, clapped when she managed a tight turn in the chair, praised her progress, but his eyes were somewhere else, always checking his phone, always stepping out to take a call. Then he started missing sessions. "I've got a Zoom meeting," he said once, waving a hand vaguely. "It's a brand collaboration call." Another time, he showed up 30 minutes late, sweating, claiming traffic. Elise knew the hospital was 11 minutes from the house. She didn't argue. She just noted it. At night, the house felt cavernous. The nursery door stayed shut. The dining table remained mostly untouched. Meals were eaten from paper, containers in separate rooms. Elise tried to hold on to normalcy. She lit candles, played their old favorite music, invited him to sit beside her, but their conversations turned thin. He asked how her pain was. She said it was manageable. He said he was tired. She didn't ask from what. They stopped filming. The cameras gathered dust. The tripod in the corner became a coat rack. Their audience moved on gradually. A few comments still trickled in. "Miss you too. Hope you're okay." Darren never replied. The brand deals dwindled. Sponsors, uncertain how to pitch a story without uplift or resolution, stopped calling. Darren took on voiceover work, short gigs. He spent more time in his home office. The door was often closed. Elise spent her days with notebooks, sketching, writing, trying to map her new world. She ordered new tools, mobility aids, organizers, even an accessible gardening tray. Small attempts at agency, at building something. One evening, she asked if he wanted to help her repot the succulents by the window. He looked up from his phone, paused, then said, "Maybe tomorrow?" Tomorrow didn't come. Later that night, she heard him on the phone laughing. The easy, open laugh she hadn't heard in months. It wasn't cruel. It was just somewhere else, unreachable. He still cared. He brought her coffee most mornings. He refilled her medication when she forgot, but the bond that once held them had thinned to a thread. Sometimes she caught him looking at the chair, not her, just the chair, with a tightness in his face that looked like mourning. Or resentment. Maybe both. She began to understand what no video could show. Survival doesn't always bind people closer. Sometimes it splits them apart so slowly that neither notices until the silence becomes unbearable. 6 months into Elise's recovery, the email arrived. Darren had been checking his inbox obsessively for weeks, hoping something would shift. And finally, it did. A producer from Horizon Network wanted to meet. A new daytime talk show was launching. In the fall, Replacing a retiring host on the 10 a.m. slot, they were looking for someone fresh, relatable, likable, already known to audiences. Someone who could carry a segment with charm but not controversy. The offer came with a promise, national exposure, a generous contract, and creative input. The show would be called Morning Spotlight. Darren Locke would be its face. He took the meeting alone. Elise stayed home that day, exhausted from back-to-back therapy sessions. When he came through the front door, hours later, he looked stunned, not giddy, not smug, just surprised, like someone trying not to show just how badly they needed the win. "They want me," he said quietly, still holding the printed offer. "Me, not us, not the channel, just me." Elise smiled. It took effort, but she meant it. "That's amazing, Darren." He sat beside her on the couch, and she turned, slightly in her chair, to face him. He laid the papers across the coffee table. It was real. A 6-month trial run with potential for 2 years. Daily airtime, a studio in Los Angeles. "But we'd have to move," he added. Elise looked down at her lap. The house they lived in, a fixer-upper, then a shared project, was finally accessible. Ramps, widened doors, lowered counters. It had taken months and cost more than they planned. Moving meant starting over again. "I can make it work," she said after a pause. "I'll call some clinics, see who's in network. We'll figure it out." He looked at her as if he didn't quite believe she meant it. The show deal moved fast. Within weeks, Darren was flying out for fittings, promotional shoots, screen tests. Elise stayed behind, managing the logistics. She interviewed moving companies, researched mobility transport services. She coordinated with her insurance caseworker to secure a new therapist in California. When Darren returned home between trips, he was different, not colder, just distant, like his mind was always in rehearsal. He spoke in clipped sentences, memorized transitions between ad breaks in the shower, practiced expressions in the mirror. Elise caught him once, standing perfectly, still repeating a line over and over. "And after the break, we'll talk to a woman who married a man she met on an airplane." Smile, tilt, gesture, reset. She didn't interrupt. She just watched. On the day the final contract came in, he asked her to look it over. She flipped through it, noting clauses, timelines, salary. Her hand paused on a paragraph about image rights. How Horizon would own all media created for the show. Darren leaned over her shoulder. "They'll want to craft a persona," he explained. "You know, keep things light, family-friendly, but not ... heavy." She didn't ask what he meant by heavy. She didn't need to. Later that night, they sat side by side watching the pilot for the show that morning. Spotlight would replace Darren took notes. Elise tried to follow along, but her thoughts drifted. "You're going to be good at this," she said softly. He didn't respond. Right away, then he reached out and squeezed her hand, not tightly, not tenderly, just enough to say he'd heard her. The next morning, she wheeled herself into the kitchen and found him already gone. A sticky note sat on the fridge. Studio called, early, flight, be back Sunday night, love you. She stared at it for a long moment, then folded it neatly and placed it in the drawer where she kept old receipts and things. She wasn't ready to throw away by the time the moving van arrived, 2 weeks. Later, she had stopped referring to the opportunity as ours. The first photo disappeared a week after they arrived in Los Angeles. It had been one of the most liked images on their shared account candid from their wedding day. Elise, leaning into Darren's shoulder, veil caught mid-breeze. The caption had once read, "My partner in all things, even drywall and disaster." It was gone without explanation. No replacement, just gone. At first, Elise assumed it was a mistake, a sync error. Maybe Darren was clearing space on the server. But then, the second post vanished. A hospital photo, her hand in his, thin for tubing, visible in the corner of the frame. He had shared it with the caption, "Strength isn't always loud." That one disappeared too. When she asked him, he shrugged. Old stuff doesn't fit the vibe anymore. The vibe, she soon understood, meant Morning Spotlight. Horizon's media team had given him new templates, a curated branding guide, clean lines, bright colors, polished messages. Personal touches were discouraged unless they aligned with the show's image: upbeat, universal, digestible. The new feed was a stream of tailored quotes, behind-the-scenes studio clips, sponsored content, and glossy stills of Darren in crisp blazers, laughing mid-conversation with celebrity guests. Elise watched it happen in silence. The slow erasure, the careful pruning. Her name stopped appearing in captions. Her face disappeared from the grid. Videos were unlisted, thumbnails replaced. Their couple's vlog was rebranded as a solo creator archive with descriptions, rewritten in third person. Her wheelchair, once visible in background shots and DIY renovation clips, now appeared nowhere. Darren didn't mention it again. He didn't offer an explanation. And Elise didn't ask. Not because she didn't care, but because she already understood. In the early weeks of the move, she tried to maintain some version of their old rhythm. She posted once on her own account a photo of her sketching beside the window in their new apartment. Palm trees reflecting in the glass. It received a few hundred likes. The comments were warm, if hesitant. "Glad to see you posting again. Miss your voice. Hope you're doing okay." But they thinned out quickly. She noticed the shift in her messages to fewer DMs, fewer tags. The audience they'd once shared had migrated to Darren's solo presence. He wasn't cruel about it. He simply adjusted the narrative without fanfare. One afternoon, as she scrolled through his page, she found a caption beneath a behind-the-scenes photo from set. "Life doesn't give you second chances, you build them." The comment section overflowed with praise. Viewers said they admired his resilience, his solo journey, how he bounced back from hard times stronger than ever. A few hinted at the past, but no one said her name. No one asked where Elise had gone. The silence was loud in its own way. In public, Darren never claimed to be single. He never denied their marriage. But in interviews, when asked about his personal life, he redirected effortlessly. "My focus right now is on building something meaningful," he'd say, "reaching people, creating space for joy." Elise heard those clips, sometimes replayed on the TV, while she sipped coffee in their apartment. His voice filled the room, smooth and practiced. She knew every pause, every breath. But it no longer sounded like someone she knew. He came home later and later. Dinners were quiet. He scrolled while they ate. When she mentioned it once, he mumbled something about being tired. The show was demanding. The team needed more from him. Branding meetings, guest prep, media coaching. She nodded, even though he wasn't really speaking to her anymore. One night, while Darren slept in the next room, she opened their old wedding video on a private tab. The algorithm no longer recommended it. She had to search by the exact title. The video buffered slowly, grainier than she remembered. They looked so young, so sure she didn't watch it all the way through. Just enough to remember that it had been real, and when she closed the tab, she didn't cry. She just sat still, letting the quiet settle, as if mourning a version of herself that had quietly been edited out. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under the door without a knock. Elise wheeled over slowly, still in her robe, coffee cooling on the kitchen counter behind her. The manila folder had no label, just her name scrawled in black, ink across the front. Inside were 10 neatly stapled pages and a post-it note that read, "Let's talk after you've read it." She knew before unfolding the first page what it was. She had seen enough press cycles around public figures to recognize the shape of control when it came dressed in legal language. A non-disclosure agreement, one that used careful phrases like confidential materials, unauthorized disclosures, and reputational risk, one that separated the public Darren from the private and erased the line she used to live on. Elise read through it slowly, eyes tracing the clauses that had clearly been written by someone who didn't know her personally, but knew exactly what she could ruin. The document prohibited her from discussing Darren's medical history, his family, their relationship, the events of the accident, and anything that could be construed as damaging to professional reputation. There were references to media channels, to podcasts, to interviews, to future creative content. It was broad, deliberately so. She didn't finish her coffee. When Darren came home that night, the folder was waiting for him on the dining table, exactly where she'd found it. He looked at it, then at her, then sat down carefully across from her. She waited. He cleared his throat. "It's standard," he began. "The network requires it from people who've been closely associated with me. It's not personal." "Elise," she said nothing. "They just want to make sure nothing sensitive gets misinterpreted." Still, she stayed silent. He leaned forward, softening his voice, like it might help. It's for your protection, too. If something gets out that paints you unfairly, this gives you a foundation to respond privately, but it keeps us out of the tabloid cycle. Elise's voice was quiet when it came. You think I'd sell our story? No, of course not. He looked down. But you might tell it, and that's enough. The words hung there, heavy, true. She pushed the folder slightly toward him with one finger. You've already told it. You just left me out of it. Darren blinked, caught off guard. This isn't about, isn't it? She asked. You delete our photos, remove our videos, stop saying my name. And now you want me to sign something saying I was never really part of it in the first place. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. He didn't argue. Instead, he stood, walked to the kitchen, and poured himself a glass of water. Elise watched his back, watched the rise and fall of his shoulders as he stood there, longer than he needed to. When he returned, he avoided her eyes. This is the life now, he said quietly. There are contracts, image rights, expectations. If something you say gets taken out of context, if I say anything at all, she interrupted, which I haven't. He nodded slowly. I know I just... ... I need to know I can trust that won't change. Elise looked at the document again. Trust. That word used to mean sharing everything. Now it meant silence. She didn't sign it that night or the next. It sat in the corner of her desk for 4 days, weighted beneath an old paperweight from their travel vlogs, the one they'd bought in Lisbon. Before any of this, eventually, she did sign. Not because she agreed, but because she understood something Darren hadn't said, that in his world now, silence was the only currency that still bought peace. She kept a copy for herself, not for leverage, not for revenge, just as a reminder of where the truth once lived and who walked away from it first. The new apartment in Los Angeles was sleek and modern, a rental selected more for proximity to the studio than for comfort or accessibility. Darren had toured it alone, while Elise stayed back in their temporary sublet. When she arrived 2 days later, the unit still smelled faintly of fresh paint and the citrus cleaner the landlord had used to wipe the granite countertops. Darren smiled as he wheeled her through the threshold. I told them we needed space. It's all on one level. No steps. Pretty good, right? The doors were narrow. The bathroom doorway was too tight. She didn't say anything. There was no ramp at the building's entrance, just to low concrete steps. Darren had carried her chair up the first time, awkwardly, saying, "We'll ask about a permanent solution," but he never did. Each time she left the building, she had to wait for him to carry the chair, or for a neighbor to help, or sometimes just abandon the trip altogether. When she brought it up a few weeks later, he nodded while looking at his phone. Yeah, I'll talk to the manager. It's just ... We're probably not staying here long anyway. They stayed. The guest room down the hallway became Elise's room. By necessity, their shared bedroom had too little clearance for her to turn comfortably. The bed frame was too high. The ensuite bathroom had a narrow tub and no grab bars. Darren suggested they use the second room just for now, until they could adapt the space or find somewhere better. He bought a second-hand adjustable bed and a floor lamp she didn't ask for. The first night she slept in the new room, he stood in the doorway and said, "Let's just do this for a bit. I'll fix it up." He didn't. She stopped calling it the guest room after the first month. It was her room. The drawers held her clothes, the shelves her books, the wall hooks her scarves. Darren's presence was reduced to a few old photos stacked on the windowsill, ones she hadn't put up but couldn't bring herself to remove. The division became routine. In the mornings, he made coffee before heading to the studio. She woke to the sound of the front door clicking shut. In the evenings, he returned, exhausted. He rarely entered her room anymore. They spoke in passing updates about bills, packages, reminders about prescriptions. The conversations felt like echoes of a life they used to share. Elise made her space livable. She ordered soft rugs that wouldn't snag her wheels. She installed a reacher tool for the closet and attached pull tabs to the lower drawers. She taught herself how to pivot from bed to chair without the aid Darren had once provided. Independence became less about pride and more about necessity. Sometimes she would hear him pacing the hallway late at night, rehearsing segment intros, practicing monologues under his breath. Other times, she'd hear nothing and Al just low hum of the television in the other room, and the occasional clink of a glass. He never mentioned moving again. The ramp remained uninstalled. The bathroom stayed narrow. Her bedroom door didn't shut properly unless slammed. Once, she caught him standing in her doorway, staring not with hostility, but with a quiet discomfort of someone who didn't know what to say in a house that no longer reflected him. She asked. He nodded, cleared his throat. I was just, ... thinking maybe we should look at places again. Something more permanent. She didn't respond, because they both knew they wouldn't. The space between them was no longer measured in square footage. It was in half-finished gestures, in postponed conversations, in the slope of a ramp that never arrived. The apartment was flat, but the distance was steep. The first time Elise heard the joke, she thought she'd misunderstood. The studio audio had been clipped and folded into a trending TikTok sound, chopped into 15 seconds of catchy cruelty. Darren stood center stage, a handheld mic in one hand, and that charming, boyish smirk on his face. You think living with a disabled person is hard? He said, pacing slightly, working the crowd like he always had. Try being married to one. The guilt trips come with wheels. Laughter erupted, loud, even in a vertical phone video. The clip cut off there, but not before the camera panned to the audience smiling, clapping, soaking it in. Elise had been at home, scrolling through her phone on the couch, when the sound played without warning. She blinked at the screen, frozen. For a moment, trying to understand what she'd just heard. Then she hit play again. And again, by the third time, she no longer felt surprised, just hollow. The full segment aired on Morning Spotlight the next day. A monologue themed around love and limitations, packaged as part of a broader episode on relationships under pressure. Darren stood beneath bright lights, wearing a navy suit with perfectly creased trousers, delivering his lines with casual confidence. It was his signature, no being relatable while towing the line of outrageous. Studio audiences ate it up. It's like your house becomes a hospital, he joked, except the patient critiques your driving and the nurse cries. During commercials, he chuckled. No one warns you that therapy sessions come with folding chairs and passive-aggressive thank you cards. More laughter. Another applause. Cue. Another grin. The teleprompter flicked, the camera panned, and the segment moved on to the guest expert. By the end of the episode, the joke was already circulating on social media in multiple formats reactions. Memes, stitched commentary, most laughed, some winced. A few criticized, but they were buried under a tide of supporters who said it was just humor, just part of his act. Elise said nothing. She didn't confront him. She didn't ask why. She already knew. The first time she appeared in his act, it was subtle. A line about being married to someone who makes every doorway a negotiation. He said it with a smile and a shrug. At the time, she still thought it was harmless, that he was coping in the only way he knew how. But the jokes kept coming. More pointed, less veiled. The woman he described wasn't always explicitly named, but she was always there looming in the background, like a character in a script. The immobile wife, the deadweight, the nagging reminder of something broken. He exaggerated her mood swings, her needs, her silences. Always with a wink. Always with a punchline. Off camera, he never mentioned the jokes. Never asked if she'd seen the segments. He left scripts on the kitchen counter sometimes, notes scribbled in the margins. She read them, though he never invited her to. Her name was never in them, just placeholders. Wife disabled, spouse reference chair. She had become a setup line. One evening, after a particularly cruel segment trended online, Elise opened her inbox to a message from someone she didn't know. A woman, kind but blunt. You don't deserve to be spoken about like that, even in comedy. Elise stared at the message for a long time, her cursor hovering over the reply button before finally closing the tab. He came home late that night, tossed his keys onto the counter, loosened his tie, and opened the fridge. She sat at the table, her sketchbook closed in front of her. They liked today's show, he said casually. Producers said the monologue hit well. She looked at him, but said nothing. He glanced in her direction, then away. You know, it's just a bit, right? That's not really how I see things. But Elise only nodded, not because she believed him, but because the truth didn't matter anymore. Not to him, not to the audience, not in a world where laughter came first and apologies never aired. In silence, she wheeled back to her room, leaving behind only the faint sound of the refrigerator door closing. The envelope came by courier this time, not certified mail, not something she had to sign for. Just a quiet knock. Then the soft thud of paper against the mat. Elise rolled to the door, opened it slowly, and found a thick manila folder resting. At the base of the frame, no return label, just her name printed cleanly in all caps. She brought it to the table, her fingers already tingling. Not from nerves, those had long since faded, but from recognition. She had been waiting for this, not hoping, just waiting. The top page wasn't what she expected. It wasn't divorce paperwork, not in the traditional sense, no mention of custody. No property disputes, no language about irreconcilable differences or dissolution of marriage. Instead, it was something new, something Darren's world had invented. A separation of public image agreement. She read slowly, parsing every legal turn of phrase. It was meticulously worded. The agreement allowed them to remain legally, married in paper, entitled but severed, their shared likeness. From that point forward, Elise's name, image, and likeness could not be associated with Darren Locke's professional materials in any form. They would, in effect, be strangers in the eyes of the public. Clause after clause detailed how she would not be acknowledged in interviews, brand appearances, or biographies. She could not post content referring to their past collaborations. Any reference to Darren's current work or personal life required pre-approval. In exchange, there was a generous monthly payment. Not alimony, not support. It was labeled media compliance consideration. Elise set the pen down after the third page. It was clear what this was. Not a divorce, not even the beginning of one. It was a deletion contract, one meant to quietly erase the last few years of their life from the Darren Locke narrative. He came home that evening with takeout. Thai food, 2 containers, 1 plastic bag. He set it on the counter and opened a soda. "I figured you'd get it today." She didn't answer. She hadn't touched the food by the time he sat across from her. His expression unreadable. "It's not what it looks like," he said. She looked up. "I'm not trying to end anything," he continued. "Not legally, it makes things simpler. For the show, for the public, for the brand." "The brand," she echoed. Of course he shifted. "I'm trying to protect you too." "From what?" she asked. "From being remembered as your wife." He exhaled sharply. "From being dragged into this world any more than you already have been. Every time I post something, someone asks. Every interview, every appearance, they want to know about the accident, about you. I'm trying to keep you out of that. You. Out of sight. It's not like that." But it was, and he knew it. She pushed the folder back, toward him, her hand steady. "No," she said. "Just one word." "But final." Darren blinked. "No, to what?" "All of it," she replied. "I'm not signing something that lets you rewrite reality just because it makes your segments cleaner." He leaned forward. "This isn't about rewriting anything. It's about moving forward. Then file for divorce." His jaw tightened. "Just briefly. We don't have to do that. Not really. What we have now works." For who silence fell between them? It wasn't bitter. It wasn't even angry. Just the kind of silence that follows a door quietly closing behind something that won't return. The folder remained on the table, unopened again. She didn't rip it, didn't toss it. She just left it there, a monument to the space they now inhabited. He never brought it up again, and she never signed. Not because it gave her power, but because it was the only thing left that said, without permission, she had existed. The letter began late one night, long after the apartment had gone still. Darren was away for a 3-day shoot in Chicago, and Elise found herself alone with nothing but a cooling cup of tea and the hum of the hallway light outside her. Bedroom door, the blank page had sat on her lap for hours. No header, no greeting, just the weight of things unsaid pressing down through her pen. She didn't plan to write it. The words simply started coming, not like a confession, more like an inventory. A record of everything that had been taken, altered, or ignored. She wrote about the first time she heard him tell a joke that didn't sound like him months after the accident, when he had just begun dabbling in monologue-style content. It had seemed like a small comment at the time, something forgettable. But looking back, she remembered exactly how it felt, like realizing you were the only person not in on a joke being told in your name. She wrote about the ramp that was never installed, about the second bedroom that became her permanent space, about the way Darren's voice changed when he spoke to his producers versus when he spoke to her, how it grew louder, more assured for them, and softer, almost unsure for her. Like he was apologizing for having to come home at all, she wrote, about the moment she realized their marriage had been moved off Kamara, that she had been turned into a backstory, a past event, something that added gravitas to his journey but had no place in his present. She wrote that she remembered the version of him who had held her hand through every physical therapy session in the first month, the one who had cried when she first sat upright on her own, the man who once called her his reason for breathing on camera, without irony. She didn't know where that version of him had gone, only that the man who stood under studio lights now bore his face, but not his heart. She wrote about silence, how it stretched between them like a second hallway in the apartment, about the NDA, about the separation of public image, about how it felt to be erased by someone still living in the same home. She listed every laugh she'd heard in the studio audience, not in anger, but as evidence, as if by naming them she could give them weight, shape, accountability. She remembered the woman in the third row who clapped too hard, the man who wiped tears from his eyes after Darren joked about her being a sentient couch cushion, the producer who told Darren, "That stuff hits due, more of that." She wrote about what she hadn't said, about all the interviews she declined, all the blog posts she never made, the podcasts that had quietly asked for her side. She'd turned them all down, not because she wanted to protect Darren, but because she still wasn't sure if she was ready to define herself as the shadow of someone else's ascent. And finally, she wrote about grief, not the kind that comes from loss, but the kind that grows in the space where love used to live. She wrote that she missed the man she married, not because he was gone, but because he had chosen a version of himself that didn't include her. The letter ended on page 9. No signature, no farewell, just a final sentence. I was there. I lived all of it. You just stopped seeing me. She folded the pages once, then twice. She placed them in an envelope, sealed it, and wrote Darren's name on the front in her careful, even handwriting. Then she slid it into the bottom drawer of her bedside table beneath an old photo strip from their trip to Copenhagen. She never told him it existed, never read it aloud, never typed it up, because she didn't need him to read it, she just needed it to be written. The call came on a quiet Tuesday morning. Elise had just finished arranging her pills for the week, her morning routine slow but steady. The phone buzzed on the counter-an unfamiliar number, but something about the area code gave her pause. She answered with a cautious hello. Still answer like you're waiting to be scolded, the voice said on the other end, warm and unmistakable. It took her a moment, then it clicked. Madeline. In the flesh, the woman replied. Well, in the voice, I'd come in person, but traffic in this city hasn't improved since you disappeared. Elise smiled, the expression unfamiliar. Madeline Carter had been a segment producer during Darren's early days in broadcasting, before his star rose and his circle shifted. Back then, Madeline had taken an immediate liking to Elise, calling her the calm to his caffeine. They'd exchanged recipes, book recommendations, and once, when Darren was stuck in traffic, Madeline had let Elise run a guest segment behind the scenes. I didn't know you were still in town, Elise said. I'm mostly out of it, Madeline replied. Retired 2 years ago, but I've still got friends inside. I keep one toe in the mess, just to stay entertained. There was a pause on the line, then, more carefully, I caught yesterday's episode. Elise didn't answer. I recognized the joke, Madeline said. Didn't laugh. Still, Elise said nothing. I also know they're taping a live audience show this Friday. It's a special anniversary highlight reel and Q&A. Darren's hosting, of course. I'm sure, Elise said. I can get you a seat. Elise blinked, uncertain if she'd heard right. What? You heard me. I called in a favor. There's a spot in the third row, no name attached. No camera cutaways planned, just a seat. But it's yours if you want it. Elise's heart began to thud softly, rhythmically, like the start of a storm. Why? Because I think sometimes being erased in public has to be answered in public. Not loud, not violent, just present. Elise didn't reply. Her fingers rested gently on the armrest of her chair, tapping lightly. Madeline continued, no obligation, but I'll send the details either way, just in case. They talked a little longer about nothing and everything. about how Madeline's garden had turned into a squirrel war zone, about how Darren's wardrobe had become progressively tighter over the years. But when the call ended, Elise sat in the stillness of her apartment for a long while. Later that afternoon, the email arrived. Subject line, Studio Pass. No fanfare, no pressure. Just the basic Steam address. Instructions, the pass would be held at the security desk under a pseudonym. No need to sign anything. She could just show up, sit down, and watch. Elise printed the pass, folded it neatly, tucked it into her purse. That night, she didn't tell Darren when. He came home, didn't ask about rehearsals or mention the show. He ate dinner alone in front of the TV. She stayed in her room, staring at the closet, wondering what one wears to quietly confront their own erasure. She pulled down a blouse she hadn't worn in years, soft teal, with a neckline he used to compliment. She held it in her lap, thinking not of revenge or confrontation, but of presence. Of what it meant to simply exist in a space that had long forgotten you. To be undeniable without saying a word. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to be seen. She just needed a seat. And now she had one. The morning of the taping arrived, slow and bright, sunlight pouring in through the slats of Elise's window, as if to remind her that today was not an ordinary day. She lay still for a moment, listening to the city stretch itself awake beyond. The glass, traffic murmured, birds warbled faintly, and somewhere in the building, a neighbor's blender hummed to life. It was all as it had been every other morning, except her breath came with more weight now, not nerves, not quite. Just a quiet steadiness she hadn't felt in years. She moved through her routine methodically. Pills, stretching, gentle turns to ease her joints into motion. Then she wheeled herself to the vanity, where a small mirror sat angled in the soft morning light. She hadn't worn makeup in a long time, not since before the accident. Really? At first, it had felt unnecessary, even absurd, to paint her face, when her body ached with such urgency. Later, it became another thing she let fade away, like earrings or perfume. Today, she returned to it with precision. The foundation went on slowly, evenly, not to conceal anything, but to affirm that this face, this skin, this woman, still belonged to the world she once occupied. She filled in her eyebrows lightly, added a hint of color to her cheeks, lined her lips with a steady hand, then pressed them together until the color set. Her hair, still thick and shoulder lengths, she brushed back into a low, elegant twist. A few silver strands glinted at the temples. She didn't hide them. She reached for her wardrobe next. Black had always been easy, safe, invisible, but she didn't want to be safe today. Instead, she chose a deep emerald blouse. The fabric was soft, flowing with long sleeves that tapered just right at the wrist. It caught the light with subtle sheen and framed her figure with quiet dignity. Paired with tailored gray slacks and low-profile flats, the ensemble looked neither overdone nor apologetic. It looked intentional, as if every piece had been chosen to say, "I am here, and I am not gone." The last thing she added was the pendant necklace Darren had given her 6 years earlier on their second anniversary, a small amber stone set in a simple gold frame. She hesitated as she held it up, unsure if wearing it meant she was still tethered to something she should have let go. But after a moment, she fastened the clasp, not because she wore it for him, but because she had worn it then, and she was the same person now. Elise glanced in the mirror once more. The woman who looked back wasn't performing strength. She wasn't dressing for battle. She was simply whole, visible, and composed. For the first time in a long time, she saw herself without apology. She packed her bag with car ID studio, pass, a bottle of water, a folded tissue, and her compact. No script, no letter, nothing to present, just herself. Pedestrians crossed without looking, but Elise moved through, it all untouched by the chaos. Her wheelchair glided across the sidewalk with quiet efficiency as the car service pulled to the curb. The driver, a soft-spoken man in his 40s, opened the door and helped with the chair. He asked no questions, and she offered no answers. She gave him the address and thanked him with a smile that held its own momentum. As the car merged onto the main road, Elise sat upright, hands folded in her lap. Her reflection passed briefly in the window beside her, sharp, poised, clear. She had no expectations for what would happen next. No plans to confront or accuse, but one thing was certain. she would not be unseen again. The studio lobby hummed with quiet energy, the kind that settles just before a live taping. Lights buzzed softly overhead, and the air carried the scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with dry cleaning starch and floor wax. Audience members murmured among themselves, some checking their phones, others scanning the room for a familiar face. Elise wheeled through the entrance, steady and composed, a folded copy of her access form resting on her lap. A woman in a headset greeted her with a tired but polite smile. "Name?" Elise glanced at the form and answered, "Marjorie Kane." The alias had been suggested by Madelinot, to odd, not to noticeable, just quiet enough to pass. The woman scanned the list, nodded, and gestured to the check-in clipboard. "You're in the third row." Her handwriting was unchanged, the same looping E that Darren had once teased her about when they signed their wedding license. The pen trembled only slightly in her grip as she handed it back. A young stagehand behind the desk looked up from his tablet. He had the relaxed posture of someone used to the chaos of production, but when his eyes landed on her face, they froze. Just for a moment, his gaze flicked down to her chair, then back up to her eyes. He blinked once, then again. Recognition stirred, but confusion softened it. He said nothing, only looked away with a stiffness that hadn't been there a moment ago. Elise didn't acknowledge it. She gave a gentle smile and moved forward with the rest of the audience. A studio assistant led the group through a pair of double doors and down a sloped hallway lined with framed promotional posters past seasons of Morning Spotlight, featuring Darren in various poses of staged sincerity. There he was, shaking hands with a best-selling author. There he was, holding a golden retriever puppy. There he was in a navy sweater, arms folded, next to the phrase, "Real people, real stories." Real stories, real laughs. Elise said nothing as they passed. The hallway opened into the main soundstage. Rows of soft red chairs faced a slightly elevated platform where a gleaming desk stood in front of the show's backdrop. Bright studio lights overhead bathed the room in warmth that was both inviting and clinical. Audience members settled in with the usual shuffling of coats, bags, and polite whispers. An usher motioned toward Elise's spot in the third aisle seat, unobstructed view. It was a good seat. Too good, maybe. Someone had made sure of it. She eased into place, her bag resting at her feet. Around her, conversations flickered. A couple speculating on the celebrity guest. A teenager excitedly explaining Darren's viral moments to her mother. No one looked at Elise for more than a passing second. She was just another person in the crowd. Until the same stagehand from earlier passed along the aisle with a clipboard. His eyes met hers again briefly, almost apologetically, and then moved on. The warm-up comedian came out to stir the room. Lights flashed, music swelled, and the audience clapped on cue. Elise joined in, just enough to blend. But her eyes never left the stage. Behind the curtain, she knew Darren was likely reviewing his script, getting powdered by makeup, running through notes with a producer. He didn't know she was here, not yet. The music shifted, the lights dimmed slightly, and a voice announced, "The start of the show." The crowd leaned forward in anticipation. Cameras panned, ready. Elise sat still, steady, her expression unreadable. The show was about to begin. But for her, the real scene hadn't started yet. The theme music kicked in, sharp and upbeat, the kind of tune that told viewers at home they were in for a lighthearted hour of daytime television. Studio lights swelled, casting a warm glow across the stage. A stage manager gave the signal from the wings, and the cameras began their quiet glide across the polished floor. Darren Locke stepped into view with his signature swagger, flashing that familiar smile, charming, confident, just slightly too polished. The audience burst into applause, the trained kind that carried no real feeling but filled the space with noise. He waved, blew a kiss to the crowd, then took his spot center stage. "Good morning, beautiful people," he shouted above the music. "You look like you've been waiting all night for me." More applause, laughter, light and eager. Darren soaked it in before launching into his monologue. "You know," he began, pacing slightly, "marriage teaches you a lot, like how to bite your tongue, and how to apologize for things you didn't do, and how to enjoy complete silence. For hours without saying a word because someone's mad at you for breathing too loud." The crowd chuckled. A few clapped. Darren glanced toward the side monitor to check his timing, then looked back at the audience with a smirk. You want to know the best-kept secret? About being married. He paused for effect, double quotes, sometimes, ... You just need to marry someone who doesn't move around too much. Some women just sit around doing nothing, literally, and somehow you still get blamed for everything. The laughter this time was louder. A few people hooted. One man in the second row slapped his knee. Darren grinned, clearly pleased with the reaction. I mean, at least with that setup, you always know where she is. No surprises. The camera on the left tracked him as he moved toward his desk. But the pan didn't stop where it was supposed to. For a second too long, it kept sweeping across the front rows of the audience. And that's when it happened. The third row, aisle seat, a woman in emerald green, composed and still Elise at. The camera lingered half a beat too long before the operator corrected the angle and swung it back toward the stage. It was subtle, but in broadcast time, it was a hesitation, a blink, enough for the control room to notice, enough for anyone watching the feed closely to wonder. On stage, Darren hadn't seen it. He was still grinning, flipping through his cue cards. But the stagehand in the wings saw, the assistant producer saw, and in the back of the audience, Madeline, who had managed to slip in, unnoticed, closed her eyes for a single moment and exhaled. Elise didn't flinch. She didn't smile. Her expression didn't change. She simply held her gaze forward. Him joke about women who sit and do nothing. Watching him rewrite her story in real time, the laughter died down, and Darren moved to introduce the next segment. But a ripple had passed through the front of the audience, an almost imperceptible shift. One woman glanced toward Elise. Another man furrowed his brow. The man who had laughed the loudest a moment ago now looked unsure. On camera, everything returned to normal. The show went on. But the image had been captured. Elise knew how live production worked. That clip would be reviewed later, the moment bookmarked. She didn't need the spotlight. She didn't need applause. She had been seen, and in the middle of a joke meant to erase her, her presence had quietly interrupted the script. That was enough for now. It happened between segments. Just a flicker, barely a full second, but it was there. Darren Locke, mid-stride as he returned to his desk after a commercial break, caught sight of her. The third row, aisle seat. The woman in emerald green, upright in her chair, calm, unblinking. His eyes met hers, and for the briefest moment, something shifted. His smile faltered, not enough for the audience to notice, not enough for the camera to catch, but enough for anyone watching him closely to see it. The edges of his mouth twitched, then tightened. His hand hesitated above the cue cards. His posture straightened, like a man bracing against a wave no one else saw coming. He looked away, back at the cards, then up again toward the camera, not the crowd. "All right," he said, voice smooth, but with a trace less buoyancy. "Our next guest has more energy than a toddler with a chocolate milk addiction." Laughter rose on cue. The lights held steady. The teleprompter rolled forward, but his rhythm was different now. His jokes came quicker, as if trying to outrun something. He laughed louder than before. A slight sheen of sweat appeared on his forehead. The makeup team had just powdered him moments earlier. It hadn't been there before. He glanced toward the audience again, but not directly at her. Just the general direction. Scanning, measuring. Elise didn't move, didn't flinch. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers lightly intertwined. Her posture was straight, her face composed, not angry, not hurt, just present. It was the absence of reaction that made it worse. If she had yelled, if she had stood up, if she had rolled her eyes or looked away than he could handle, that he could dismiss as a disruption, a confrontation. But her stillness was undeniable. It left no room to pivot. The segment continued. Darren brought out a guest chef. They bantered over a bowl of quinoa salad. Darren pretending to gag for laughs when he tasted it. The audience responded, but the laughter had cooled just slightly. Some claps were delayed. A few faces in the front row had stopped smiling. Darren glanced again. This time his gaze hovered a fraction too long on the third row before he blinked and turned away. He knew not just who she was, but what her being here meant. Elise hadn't come to make a scene. She hadn't come to speak or accuse, and that's what rattled him. Because silence in public wasn't silence. It was proof. He tapped his index finger against the desk 3 short beats, a nervous habit he hadn't shown since his early days on air. His eyes flicked to the teleprompter, then to the control room window at the back. His voice cracked slightly on the next line, but he cleared his throat and kept going. To the casual viewer, Darren Locke was still himself, funny, charming, in control. But for anyone watching closely, the veneer was beginning to thin. Backstage, a junior producer leaned toward the stage manager and whispered, "What's going on with him today?" The stage manager just shook her head. Darren powered through the segment and introduced the next guest, a social media influencer with a line of fitness water. He laughed at her jokes, nodded at her branding tips, even took a staged sip from her neon bottle. But his energy was unsteady now. Not frantic, just ... careful. And all the while, Elise remained still. She didn't stare him down. She didn't shift in her seat. She let the cameras roll, the jokes land, the segments pass because she wasn't the interruption. She was the reminder. And Darren, beneath the lights and the laughter, was no longer sure the audience was only watching him. The segment was supposed to be routine. Darren leaned back in his chair, relaxed, as the screen behind him lit up with the words, "Call-in Confessions." The audience clapped, a lighthearted track played, and a producer in the wings gave him a thumbs up. This was a favorite bit scripted, a chance for Darren to show off his wit in real time. Listeners called in, shared funny stories, asked for advice, and Darren gave them quick, punchy responses that often ended up going viral online. The first 2 callers were light and forgettable. One woman asked how to tell her neighbor to stop singing in the hallway. A college student asked if it was okay to dump someone via meme. Darren played it cool, bantered easily, and the audience laughed along. Then the third call came through. A male voice, mid-40s maybe, calm, steady. "Hey Darren, big fan. Just wanted to ask something that's been on my mind since your earlier days online." Darren smiled, eyes flicking to the camera. "All right, shoot," the caller continued. "Wasn't your wife Elise, right? Wasn't she in a wheelchair after that accident a few years ago? I used to follow your vlogs, just wondering, what happened to her?" It was like the air changed. Not in a dramatic way. There was no gasp from the crowd, no dropped lights, no flashing warnings, but something in the atmosphere shifted slightly out of place, like a dropped beat in a familiar song. Darren froze for a heartbeat. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, a flash in his eyes, too quick to name. Then the smile returned tight, clipped. "Well, you know," he said, trying to laugh, "life gets complicated sometimes. Things change. People grow in different directions." The caller didn't laugh. "Yeah, but you never really addressed it. She kind of disappeared. That was around the time you got the talk show deal, right?" A rustle moved through the audience, subtle but collective. Darren adjusted his earpiece and leaned forward, trying to regain control. "Look, I appreciate the concern, really. Elise and we've had a lot of private moments that didn't make it online, and that's by design. Some parts of life are just better left personal." The audience gave a few supportive claps. Half-hearted, a producer in the wings signaled to cut the call, but Darren lifted a hand. He didn't want to look like he was dodging. He turned to the camera with that same practiced ease. "We've both moved on in different ways, and I wish her well." Next caller, the control room muted the line. The screen behind him updated, and another caller's name appeared. But the damage had been done. Had not looked away once. She hadn't reacted, hadn't shifted, hadn't blinked. But her presence in that moment pressed down on everything else in the room. Darren glanced her way, not directly, just her ward, that side of the crowd, and for a second, his eyes met hers. There was no accusation in her face, no anger, only steadiness. Thing he had tried to joke away, the thing he had written out of the script. It was sitting in his audience. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't speak. She simply bore witness. The next caller was already speaking, something about a bad date at a bowling alley. Darren nodded along, offered a joke, but his voice had lost its edge. The crowd still laughed, but less freely. The room felt thinner, stretched. Because someone had asked the question he never wanted heard, and the woman with the answer wasn't on the phone, she was already in the room. In the control room, behind the studio, where camera angles, lighting cues, and segment timing lived on glowing panels and hushed instructions, The atmosphere was no longer smooth. What had started as just another Thursday morning taping of Morning Spotlight was now slipping beyond the script. Julie Hart, one of the senior producers, stood with her headset halfway off, fingers tight around a coffee cup she hadn't touched in 20 minutes. She was watching Darren's face through monitor 2, rewinding the last exchange with the caller, replaying that moment in her mind. The question, the hesitation, the look toward the third row. She turned toward Mike, the assistant director, who was pacing behind the soundboard with a sheaf of cue cards in hand. Was that caller pre-screened? Mike shook his head. He gave a name, nothing flagged. Said he wanted to talk about Darren's old videos. Julie exhaled slowly. We should have seen that coming. They both turned to the main feed again. Darren was laughing at something the current caller said about tripping over a dog leash, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He was rattled, not falling apart, but cracked. Elise hadn't spoken once, hadn't moved. But it didn't matter. Julie tapped her headset mic. Stagecam zoom 3% tighter on Darren. Keep the crowd in soft focus. If we catch her, again, legal's going to have a fit. The camera operator acknowledged the instruction, and the frame shifted slightly. Madeline, watching from a shadowed corner near the technical booth, said nothing. She hadn't told Elise what to do or how to act. All she'd done was make the seat available. Now she was watching the network struggle with a presence they couldn't predict. The executive producer, Charles Rayner, had joined them summoned from his office upstairs when the studio tech team flagged the moment Elise had appeared in the camera pan. Charles was a man of protocol ratings, structure, advertiser, confidence. He didn't like off-script, and this was as off-script as it got. Do we know if she signed anything? He asked Julie, arms crossed tightly. She signed a waiver. Under a guest alias, Julie replied, She's not micked, she hasn't spoken, and technically, she hasn't broken any policy. But the moment that caller brought her up, she didn't react. She hasn't disrupted, she's just ... there. Charles didn't like that answer. She's undermining the segment flow. Darren's not in control. Julie looked at him, or maybe Darren, just doesn't like being confronted by reality. Charles didn't reply. The dilemma wasn't legal. It wasn't technical. It was narrative. For 3 years, Darren Locke had shaped his story carefully. From his online content to the curated talk show image, he'd erased the parts that didn't serve his version of success. Elise's silence, her absence, had made that erasure possible. Now her silence was rewriting the script in real time. Viewers at home might not know exactly what was happening, but they would feel it. Something unspoken was in the room, shifting, tone, altering rhythm. Darren's timing was slightly off. His smile didn't land the same. The jokes had less lift, because somewhere in the audience sat the story he didn't want to tell. Do we cut to commercial early? Mike asked. Julie thought about it. If we cut now, it looks like we're panicking. Let it ride out. He has one more segment and a final monologue. And after that, Julie looked at the screen again. Darren was sipping from a water bottle, nodding along to a caller, but his eyes flicked once more toward the third row. The control room couldn't see Elise's face now, but Julie didn't need to. We let the credits roll, she said, and then we see what happens next. Because Elise didn't need a microphone. She had already changed the show. The moment the jingle signaled the commercial break, Darren pushed away from his desk more abruptly than usual. The lights dimmed just slightly, as they always did during off-air transitions, but the tension didn't drop with them. It hung thick in the studio, settled in the air like fog. He didn't wave to the audience this time, didn't give them his usual wink or finger gun. He just walked briskly, jaw tight toward the wings. A production assistant instinctively moved aside as he passed. The second he cleared the curtain, his voice sharpened. Who the hell let her in? Julie, standing near the monitors backstage, didn't answer. Neither did Mike. Everyone else found something to suddenly be doing, adjusting clipboards, checking headsets, pretending to be occupied with cables that had already been secured. Darren turned to the nearest assistant, a young woman in a headset, who looked up too late to pretend she hadn't heard. I'm asking a simple question, he said, voice louder now. Who let Elise in here? She stammered, eyes wide. I don't know, sir. I wasn't at the guest check-in this morning. He looked at Julie. Julie didn't flinch. She signed a waiver under a different name. It cleared legal. You're not the only one allowed to invite guests. That wasn't a guest, Darren snapped. That was a trap. He stepped in closer, voice low now, but seething. She sat in my audience while I was on live television, and she didn't say a word, Julie cut in. Didn't make a scene. Didn't even shift in her seat. You're the one who brought her into the spotlight with your reaction. Darren shook his head, face red with frustration. You think this is about me? That woman's been waiting to humiliate me. Julie raised her eyebrows, then glanced. Back at the monitor, where the countdown clock ticked down the seconds until they were back live, from where I'm standing, she's done the opposite. She gave you a chance to speak honestly. You chose not to. Silence followed. Darren stood still, one hand at his waist, the other clenched at his side. The stagehand passed behind him quickly, not making eye contact. She's not staying for the next segment, Darren said firmly. Julie looked at the screen again. She has every right to stay. Then you can explain to legal and the network what happens if this turns into a PR disaster. Julie met his gaze. It already is. He turned away, back toward the small private corridor that led to the green room. If she's still there by the end of this show, I walk. Noted, Julie said. But Darren didn't respond. The door clicked shut behind him. Back in the audience, Elise hadn't moved. The crowd chatted softly among themselves, unsure whether something was wrong. A few stagehands passed through the aisles, offering polite reassurances about a quick break. Elise simply waited. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to stand. Her presence was doing more than any outburst could. In a hallway lined with posters of past episodes, Darren sat alone on a leather bench, breathing through his nose, palms pressed against his thighs. His image was everywhere on the walls, him shaking hands with celebrities, laughing on stage, holding awards. Perfect stills from a perfect narrative. And now she was sitting inside it. The timer beeped, 30 seconds. Julie's voice came through. It comes. Back in 30, cue the segment bumper. We're live again in 5. No one said Elise's name again, but no one needed to. The lights warmed again, a signal that the show was coming back from break. On cue, the audience settled into their seats, though not as easily as before. There was a shift, subtle but unmistakable. The laughter had grown tentative. A low hum replaced the earlier enthusiasm, the energy no longer flowing from the stage, but from within the crowd itself. Elise was still there. Third row, aisle seat. Emerald green blouse, catching the light just enough to distinguish her from the rest. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't changed her posture, but the audience had. A woman in her 20s, 2 seats over, leaned toward the person next to her and whispered, "I think that's his ex, the one from the vlogs." The other whispered back, "Wasn't she in the accident? I thought she moved away." Across the row, a man pulled out his phone, quietly, subtly, not to record the show, but to search. He typed Darren Locke wife wheelchair into his browser. Another phone lit up 3 seats down. Then another. Fingers scrolled, thumbs paused. Over headlines, there she was, Elise Locke, a few years ago. Her name had trended after a car accident nearly took her life. At the time, the couple's followers rallied online with hashtags and donation links. There were updates from hospital rooms, soft music, over footage of Darren pushing her wheelchair through rehab centers, videos titled Our Hardest Year, and then nothing. No formal announcement, no video. Farewell, she just disappeared from his content. His captions stopped mentioning her. Photos were scrubbed. Fans assumed it had been too hard, that they'd separated quietly, but the truth had never been spoken. Now, she was sitting in the studio audience. Not disruptive, not crying, not holding a sign or demanding attention. Just sitting. And that stillness drew more eyes than any headline could. The studio's usual unspoken rule, don't use phones during taping, was unraveling. More screens glowed softly behind cupped hands. People weren't taking photos. They were reading, watching, comparing timelines, looking again at Darren, then back to her. One audience member opened an old video from 3 years ago. Darren and Elise laughing in a kitchen, flour on their noses. He paused it, glanced at her now, then back. At the screen, the resemblance was undeniable. But it wasn't just her appearance, it was her presence. Even now, silent and unmoving, she had the same quiet gravity near the back. A young couple debated in whispers whether this was staged. Maybe it's for ratings, the man murmured, like a dramatic reveal or something. The woman shook her head. She doesn't look like she's here for the cameras. Backstage, producers noticed the growing buzz. One stagehand stepped out to glance at the crowd. He counted 5 phones, out 6, then 8. None were filming, but all were locked into something else. The story beneath the show. On stage, Darren returned to the desk. His smile was forced, tighter than before. He introduced the next guest, a dog trainer with a viral YouTube channel. The crowd clapped, but it wasn't the same. The applause had lost its center. Even the guest noticed. She looked around, then whispered something to Darren as she sat down. He gave a nod, too quick to mean anything. He didn't look toward the audience again, but Elise was still there. And now, so were the questions. Whispers turned into Google searches. Search results turned into tabs. And by the time the segment ended, more than half the audience knew who she was, and that she wasn't part of today's script. They didn't leave. They stayed seated, phones tucked away again, but minds elsewhere. Eyes watching not just Darren's words, but his silences. Watching who he avoided, watching the way the room seemed to bend not around the stage, but around that single, quiet seat in the 3rd row. And for the first time in years, Elise Locke was being seen. When Darren stepped back onto the stage, the light that usually welcomed him didn't feel quite the same. It bathed him as always, bright, flattering, designed for broadcast, but something in his expression had shifted. Gone was the effortless swagger, the polish of a man fully in control of his stage. He walked slower now, his usual bounce muted. The applause still came, but it was softer, uncertain, like the audience was waiting to know what version of him would return. He took his seat behind the desk, adjusted the microphone with fingers that hesitated just a second too long, and forced a smile that didn't quite meet his eyes. "Welcome back to Morning Spotlight," he said. His voice still carried, but the rhythm had changed. "In case you missed it, I was just reminded that we all come from somewhere. Some of us carry a little more than others." There was a pause, not dramatic, just enough to signal weight. He looked straight into the lens. But then, with almost surgical precision, his gaze drifted left. To the 3rd row, Elise didn't move. She didn't react. She simply met his eyes. The audience grew quiet, not silent, not tense, but alert. They weren't sure if this was part of the show or if something more unscripted was continuing to leak through the cracks. Darren cleared his throat. "You know," he continued, forcing a chuckle, "marriage is kind of like airline travel. You think you're getting a smooth flight, and then suddenly you're stuck in turbulence. Seatbelt signs blinking, and someone's crying over a tray of pretzels." A few audience members laughed, reflexively, but it wasn't full-bodied laughter. "More like habit," he continued, but stumbled over the next line. "And you think you wonder, should I have packed lighter? Should I have just taken the aisle seat and left the rest behind?" He blinked, caught himself. "Sorry, that was bad metaphor day." More nervous laughter now. From the back row, one man coughed into his hand. Darren leaned forward. "On the desk, but seriously," he said, "we all have baggage, right?" Again, he looked directly at her. This time longer, not a glance and address. Elise met his eyes without flinching. Something passed between them that couldn't be heard. Only felt, not accusation, not reconciliation. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the distance he had spent years building was no longer enough to keep her out of frame. He blinked first. Darren turned back to the camera. Next guest is someone who turned old tires into musical instruments. For kids, can't wait to hear how that happened. But the crowd didn't shift back easily. The camera panned slightly, catching the smiling face of the new guest walking toward the stage. Darren stood to greet them, shaking hands, offering polite gestures. The guest said something upbeat, but Darren's reply came a half-second late. Even his timing had changed, and as he returned to his seat for the interview, he couldn't stop glancing toward the monitor to his left, the one he usually never looked at during live taping, the one showing the wide-angle crowd shot. He never said her name, not once, but everyone now knew who he meant. Because baggage wasn't always what you carried. Sometimes it was who you erased. And sometimes it came back not to haunt you, not to hurt you, but simply to be seen again. Elise still hadn't spoken, still hadn't stood. But now Darren Locke host personality. Brand was no longer speaking from a platform above her. He was reacting from the same level, and that was a first. The next guest was mid-sentence when it happened. A cheerful woman named Deborah, holding a homemade xylophone crafted from bike parts and rubber tubing, was explaining how music had changed her classroom. Darren nodded along, asking the usual, encouraging questions, but his tone was flat. His eyes drifted too often toward the side monitors, never staying with the guest long enough to feel present. The audience sensed it. The moment was still cheerful on the surface, Miles. Applause, signs flashing, polite chuckles, but the energy was frayed, tense, waiting. Then, during a lull in the conversation, a new sound entered the room. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, it was quiet, almost conversational, but it cut through the artificial brightness like a crack through glass. "I never disappeared," Elise said. The words weren't shouted. She didn't stand, but they landed with weight. They moved through the studio like wind through a still forest. Everyone turned. The guests stopped speaking. The crew froze. One of the audience members gasped a small, involuntary sound. Even Darren didn't move at first. He sat completely still. His face didn't contort, no shock or rage, just stillness. His eyes locked on the voice he had known better than any other. "I never disappeared," she repeated, softly, evenly. Julie in the control booth didn't give any instructions. No one cued a cut to commercial. No one needed to. Everyone knew. This moment was beyond managing. Elise didn't raise her voice. She didn't elaborate. But in that one sentence, everything shifted. It wasn't just a statement about her presence. It was a correction, a refutation of every implication, every silent erasure, every joke that pretended she had faded quietly away. It wasn't a confrontation. It was a re-entry. Darren swallowed hard. His lips parted slightly, as if about to speak. But he said nothing. For the first time in years, his words failed him. Someone in the audience clapped. One short, confused clap, then silence again. Not awkward, not embarrassed, just stunned. A studio built on noise had run out of script. The camera didn't turn to her. They didn't need to. Her sentence echoed enough to fill the frame. Never disappeared. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't for Darren. It was for herself, and for everyone watching who had ever been cast aside with a smile and a shrug. She had let them write her out quietly before. Let the world assume her vanishing was mutual, or polite, or inevitable. "Not anymore," a production assistant backstage whispered. "Do we respond?" Julie shook her head. No, that was the response. On stage, Darren reached for his water again, but his hand trembled slightly. He didn't sip, just held the bottle and nodded vaguely toward the guest, trying to reclaim the rhythm. To her credit, didn't try to fill the silence. She looked at Darren, then at the crowd, then back toward the source of the voice. She offered a quiet, respectful nod in Elise's direction, and then she waited. No one asked Elise to leave. No one asked her to continue, because in just 5 words, she had done what hours of airtime couldn't, spoken truth without spectacle. She hadn't disappeared. She had simply waited. And now that she had spoken, the show couldn't go back to what it was before, neither could Darren, nor the audience. The room slowly exhaled, and Elise remained seated. Silent again, but everyone heard her. The silence after Elise's words felt heavier than applause. No music cue followed, no commercial jingle filled the air. Just the hum of studio lights, the faint creak of a camera rig adjusting, and the weight of everything unsaid now echoing. In every corner of the room, Darren sat motionless at his desk, hand still wrapped around the water bottle he hadn't touched. He looked toward the monitors again, not to check his reflection, but to see her framed by the crowd, still seated, still calm, but now unmistakably at the center of the room. She spoke again, this time slower, not louder. "I didn't disappear. You erased me." No one breathed in the booth. Julie's hand hovered over her headset mic, but she didn't give a cue. No director dared cut away. Elise hadn't stood up, hadn't raised her voice, and yet she had taken control of the entire broadcast with a single sentence. Darren blinked hard. Somewhere in the crowd, someone whispered, "Did you hear what she said?" A phone slipped back into a purse. A man lowered his camera. not daring to film what felt sacred too real to be captured. Elise didn't flinch. Darren leaned forward slightly, elbow resting on the desk, searching her face. She wasn't angry, there was no fire in her eyes, but there was something harder to dismiss: clarity. For years, Darren had let the narrative drift. He didn't announce a divorce, he didn't release a statement, he simply stopped posting photos, unfollowed her, changed his content, talked around the absence like it was mutual, like she had chosen silence. But now, in 5 words, she corrected the record. It wasn't distance, it wasn't tragedy, it was erasure. She hadn't left. He had painted over her. Darren opened his mouth, but no words came. The guest beside him, a community teacher with a heartwarming project, sat politely, hands folded in her lap, unsure of what she had stepped into. This wasn't the show she'd agreed to, but it was one she suddenly respected more than she could explain. No one asked Elise to explain herself. She didn't. She didn't follow the sentence with a plea or a demand. She just looked at Darren and waited. He stood up, not angrily, not dramatically, just slowly. His palms pressed against the desk as he rose, the wheels in his mind visibly spinning. Years of control, years of grooming his image, years of scripts all thinning in the light of that one line. He stepped to the front of the stage. "Take 5, he asked. To no one in particular, Julie didn't answer. She didn't need to. Elise tilted her head slightly, still watching him, not to follow him, not to finish the moment, but to witness how he handled the truth. The moment wasn't hers to resolve, it never had been. The sentence stood on its own. "I didn't disappear. You erased me." It echoed not because it was shouted, but because it hit where silence had festered. It wasn't accusation, it was fact, delivered like an open folder placed gently on a table. Unavoidable, Darren looked out at the crowd. We're still there, still seated, still watching, but no longer entertained. Now they were remembering, reevaluating, and he knew, in that moment, that the show might go on, but not the way it had before. Because something had broken open. Not a scandal, not a spectacle, just the truth, and everyone had heard it. The studio, normally a machine of motion cameras, gliding, lights shifting, producers gesturing, suddenly fell still. The sentence Elise had spoken hung in the air, weightless and unbearable at once. "I didn't disappear. You erased me." No music played, no countdown ticked. The laughter signs above the audience blinked off, as if even they understood their time had passed. For once, nothing moved. Not the host, not the guest, not the crew. Darren remained standing. Beside his desk, his hand dangled at his side, the other clenched into a loose fist near the microphone. His mouth was slightly open, but no sound came. It was as if words, his usual currency, had abandoned him. The very thing that had made him his voice was now the one thing he couldn't seem to summon. The audience, so used to reacting on cue, sat paralyzed. Not out of fear, not confusion, but awe. The kind of silence that follows something too true to dismiss. Even the rustle of a jacket or the shifting of legs was absent. Everyone had gone still, not out of politeness, but because it felt wrong to move, and yet Elise had not stood. She hadn't raised her voice or made a scene. Her calm presence, her single sentence, had broken the performance without touching. It had power, the ability to shift an entire room with clarity rather than confrontation, was something no script could match. The guest, Deborah, who had moments ago been speaking about recycled instruments, sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes were no longer on Darren. They were on Elise. There was no judgment in her expression, just something close to respect. Stage manager, headset half on, didn't issue commands. No call for commercial, no wrap-it-up hand signals. The earpiece crackled once with an incoming line from the control booth, but even that stayed unanswered. Julie in the booth had leaned back in her chair, staring at the monitor showing the wide shot of the room. She whispered, mostly to herself, "Let it stay quiet." Darren's breathing became audible. Not heavy, not theatrical, just noticeable, like he was suddenly aware of his own presence for the first time in years. He looked down at his notes, bullet points, written in blue marker. Upcoming guests, questions about pet food trends, a viral clip from a toddler birthday gone wrong. None of it mattered. Not right now. Those words on paper looked alien. His fingers hovered over them, then curled into a fist, pulling back. Slowly, He turned toward the audience, not the cameras, but the people. He looked out over the rows. Some stared back, some glanced toward Elise. A few bowed their heads. And there, in the third row, still seated, Elise looked back at him. No smugness, no triumph, just eyes steady and clear. She had not come to gloat. She hadn't come to destroy him, but she had come to be acknowledged. Her sentence had done more than speak truth. It had reordered the room. No one clapped, no one cheered, but the air shifted from performance to reality, from narrative to fact. For a brief moment, it no longer felt like a taping. It felt like something else entirely. A reckoning not designed for broadcast, but happening on broadcast anyway. And that terrified Darren more than any cancellation ever could. He cleared his throat softly, like a man trying to remember what it meant to be heard for something real. Still, he said nothing. The guest didn't prompt him. The audience didn't rescue him. The crew didn't redirect, because for that single moment, the show had become real. And once real enters a room like that, it echoes. Elise had made sure of that. It started slowly, just one clip, shared by a viewer who had been watching the live broadcast when Elise spoke. A 10-second moment from an older episode of Morning Spotlight, where Darren had joked, "My wife used to be so full of energy. Now she's just full of silence. Can't even run from arguments anymore." The audience in that episode had laughed loudly. Darren had grinned, adjusted his collar, and moved on to the next punchline. No one questioned it. No one paused the taping, but now in the wake of Elise's quiet sentence, I didn't disappear. You erased me, everything looked different. That same 10 seconds, posted on social media with a new caption, "Was this ever okay?" spread rapidly. What had once aired as humor now landed as cruelty. By the end of the day, more clips surfaced. A montage formed in the replies and quote tweets. Moments Darren had crafted with studio writers, framed as self-deprecating marriage humor, now played like open mockery. "You think it's hard being disabled?" he had said in one segment. "Try being married to someone who can't even chase you when you leave the toilet seat up." At the time, the audience roared, "Now." Those laughs felt hollow complicit. The crowd's faces in the background, once part of the set's atmosphere, became subjects of scrutiny. Did they know who he was talking about? Were they laughing because they recognized Elise's absence, or because they had been taught to forget her altogether? Viewers began time-stomping episodes. "This aired 2 months after her accident," one comment read. He was making jokes. While she was still in physical therapy, another pointed out an episode where Darren had opened with a sarcastic monologue. Marriage is about compromise. Like deciding which part of the house your spouse gets to quietly disappear into. It had seemed clever at the time. Rewatching it now, people noticed the edge in his tone. The internet doesn't forget once it remembers. Soon, #ErasedHer began trending. Not as a slogan Elise had created, but as a reaction to her restraint, her dignity, her single sentence that required no campaign, no confrontation. Her truth had become a mirror. And people didn't like what they saw in their reflection. Even fans who had defended Darren began to reconsider. "I laughed at those jokes," one longtime viewer wrote. "Now I realize I was clapping for someone being erased in real time." Others dug deeper, old interviews, behind-the-scenes clips, Q&A sessions where Darren avoided questions about his personal life with practiced charm. Now, those evasions looked like misdirection, calculated, intentional. The production team issued, "No statement, not yet." The PR team drafted 3 versions, each more cautious than the last. Darren was advised to take a break from social media. He deemed single quotes. Instead, he posted a photo of the studio empty chairs, dark lights with a caption, "Some silences are louder than words." The post was not received well. "Is this supposed to be about you?" One reply read, "She didn't scream. You did." Others screenshotted the post and placed it side by side with clips of Elise, pushing herself through rehab with quiet determination. Side by side with the jokes he had told. Side by side with the moment she said, softly but clearly, "You erased me." The comparison was unforgiving. Darren had always thrived in control and air, in public, within the edit. But old footage doesn't bend, it just waits. Now, that footage was playing again. But this time, no one was laughing. And Elise, still silent, remained untouched by the chaos. She hadn't tweeted, she hadn't spoken to the press, she didn't have to, was already on tape. They just hadn't heard it the first time. The fallout came in waves. At first, it was subtle. One sponsor paused its weekly integration with Morning Spotlight, citing a temporary realignment of values. Another pulled their banner ad from the show's website entirely. By the end of the week, 3 major sponsors had withdrawn. The show, once a golden hour for advertisers, was now under review. Darren remained silent for 2 days. Publicists debated tone. Legal teams argued over phrasing. Should he say he was misinterpreted, that it was comedy, that he'd changed? Ultimately, they decided on a middle path. He posted a video, seated in his dressing room, wearing a plain blue sweater. The lighting was soft, meant to seem vulnerable. No graphics, no background music, just Darren looking into the camera. Over the years, I've told jokes that, in hindsight, were hurtful. Not only to someone I once loved deeply, but to those who saw themselves in her. I see now how those words carried weight, how silence isn't always consent, and laughter doesn't always mean something's funny. For that, I'm sorry. He paused deliberately, allowing the apology to breathe. I never meant to erase anyone, least of all her. Comments flooded in immediately. Some accepted the apology, others called it performative. A few noted that it was strange how he still wouldn't say her name. Elise never acknowledged the video, because by then, she was already gone, not vanished, not hidden, just elsewhere. Away from the lights, the cameras, the stage that had never been hers to begin with. She didn't post statements. She didn't give interviews. No Instagram stories, no tell-all features. Her silence wasn't absence, it was choice. Where Darren scrambled to reclaim the narrative, Elise quietly stepped out of it. Those who tried to find her found only fragments. A blurred photo of a wheelchair user at a community lecture in Seattle. A local article about an accessibility panel where one attendee mentioned a former content creator who spoke about personal erasure, no name listed, no follow-up. She had returned to her own life, one no longer footnoted by Darren's A. Fan forum dedicated to their old vlogs tried to organize a public statement of support. The moderators ultimately locked the thread. She doesn't owe us access, one of them wrote. Darren's show limped along. Ratings dipped. The format was tweaked. A rotating cast of co-hosts was introduced. He smiled thinner, laughed quieter, but something had broken. It wasn't just Elise's presence that had changed the air, it was her exit. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't sued. She hadn't exposed secrets or demanded payback. She had simply corrected the story, and then she walked away. Sponsors noticed. So did fans. So did the crew. A makeup artist quietly moved to a new show. A segment writer resigned. Internally, the team called it the echo effect. Not because Elise made noise, but because she didn't need to. She let the truth speak, then stepped aside to let others hear it. One day, weeks later, a small envelope arrived at the studio. It was addressed to the head producer. No return address. Inside, a single card. On the front, a photo of the original set from their couple's vlog. The one with the yellow couch and mismatched pillows. On the back, handwritten in steady cursive, "Some stories aren't yours to tell." No signature, just a full stop. The building was modest. 3 stories, no elevator, just a brick facade and a narrow wooden ramp recently added to the front entrance. Darren stood at the bottom of it, shifting from one foot to the other, holding a folded envelope in his hand. It was worn at the corners, like it had been carried around for days before today. He didn't look up at the windows, didn't try to guess which one was hers. He just stood there, watching the wind tug lightly at the branches above. A neighbor passed with a bag of groceries, gave him a glance, and walked on. He had come alone. No driver, no assistant. No suit jacket, either just a gray hoodie. The kind Elise used to borrow for long nights editing videos together on the couch. He hadn't worn it in years. It still smelled faintly of coffee and detergent. Or maybe that was just his memory playing tricks. He didn't know if she was home. He didn't call ahead. She hadn't blocked his number, but she never answered either. No returned texts, no replies to the birthday card he mailed. No response to the video he posted. Just the same silence she had held since the studio lights dimmed that day. He walked up the ramp slowly, almost cautiously, and stood at the door. His reflection stared back at him in the small glass panel above the doorknob. For a moment, he didn't knock Dot. Instead, he placed the envelope gently in the mailbox beside the door. Then he stepped back. It wasn't long before he heard the faint sound of the door opening. Not all the way, just the click of the lock and the slow creak of hinges. He didn't turn around. He didn't want to force a meeting. He had no right to. He heard the envelope being taken. A pause. Then the door closed again. No voice, no confrontation, no acknowledgement. He stood still. Maybe she had read it before. Maybe she had seen him on the security camera and waited until he stepped away. Or maybe she hadn't expected him at all and was deciding what to do. In the letter, he had written what he couldn't say on air. Not apologies. She had already heard those, but the pieces he never allowed himself to admit before. That he had been afraid. That her injury changed him not because she became different, but because he was too small to carry what it revealed about him. That he had performed attachment because it was easier than admitting helplessness. That the jokes weren't funny, even to him, but they bought him laughter he didn't deserve, and that none of it erased the truth. She had shown up every day when he didn't. He didn't ask for forgiveness, just space for the truth to land. Now he waited. Another door opened down the hall. Someone's dog barked twice, and then fell silent again. A child laughed from the second floor. Life went on. Even when apologies came too late, he turned, ready to leave. But before he stepped off the ramp, he heard the sound behind him, not the door opening again, just a soft thump. He looked down at the base of the mailbox, sat a different envelope. New paper, clean corners, no stamp, no name. He picked it up. Inside there were only 5 words, written in the same hand that had once left post-it notes on his mirror. Years ago, some things stay better quiet. He didn't smile, he didn't cry. He just nodded once, as if to someone behind a closed door. Then he left. The studio didn't have lights that moved. No cranes, no booms, no control room humming behind the scenes. Just a row of windows facing north and the soft, constant hiss of a radiator that never quite turned off in winter. Of acrylic paint and eucalyptus cleaning spray, the walls were covered in uneven canvases, some finished, some still raw with charcoal outlines, some no more than streaks of color where someone had tried and stopped and tried again. Just after 8, the wheels of her chair moved quietly across the smooth floor. She didn't wear makeup anymore, unless she wanted to. Today, she didn't. Her hair was tied back with a faded green bandana. The name tag clipped to her shirt read simply, Elise Instructor. In the corner, a young man in his early 20s dabbed at a canvas with short, jerky strokes. A woman in her 60s next to him stared at a blank sheet, hands resting motionless in her lap. Across the room, an older vet named Henry tilted a mug of coffee. Precariously close to his paint water again, Elise moved among them without needing to speak. A soft hand on a shoulder, a nod toward a brush. Sure about that color? The language wasn't performance anymore. It didn't need to be. Here, silence was part of the rhythm, not a disruption. When someone asked what she used to do before this, she often said, "I used to live on camera." Sometimes they asked more, sometimes they didn't. She never offered Darren's name. Not because it hurt, but because it no longer defined the story. The rehab center was a community more than a facility. Some students came for physical therapy, others for mental health recovery, others just to be reminded that their presence mattered. In Elise's class, no one had to finish their work. The goal wasn't completion, it was return. She taught from a curriculum of softness, light with darkness on canvas, how to hold a brush even when fingers didn't want to cooperate, how to start over without apology. These were lessons no university had given her. They were carved from the last few years, unspoken and slow. At noon, a delivery arrived, supplies donated from a local gallery. A younger assistant opened the box and held up a new set of brushes. "These yours now?" he said. Elise smiled, shaking her head. "No, just visitors." Later, as the sun reached its highest point, it cast long light across the wall. The students worked without direction, and Elise sat watching them, not judging, not correcting, just present. The most radical thing she could do, be there fully. Quietly dot in the hallway outside the studio, a flyer hung on a bulletin board. It featured Elise's photo, not a publicity shot, just a candid taken from the side. The caption underneath read, Art as Recovery, Tuesdays with Elise. No one clapped at the end of the sessions. There was no final shot, no credits rolling, no soundtrack swell. The students packed up in silence or soft murmurs. They nodded goodbye instead of waving. Some left pieces unfinished on purpose, so they had a reason to return. When the room was empty, Elise wheeled herself to the far window. The trees outside had just started to turn, yellow at the tips, like they were remembering how to change. She pulled a small notebook from her bag, one with a brown leather cover. Inside were sketches not of Darren, not of stages or microphones or cameras, but of hands, window frames, brushstrokes, of quiet moments captured simply because they mattered. She didn't write much anymore. But today she wrote one sentence. At the bottom of a page, presence is not the same as attention. She closed the book, placed it back in her bag, and turned toward the door. Outside, the world continued. And this time, it didn't need an audience.